What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video we are hopping into our starts and sits for the running back position for week 2 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button if you are new to the channel, and feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. Starts, sits, trades, drops, ads, waiver wire, injuries, whatever it may be, your personal lineup. Let me know at any position, any aspect whatsoever. I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Week 1 was absolutely crazy, kind of a slap in the face, kind of all over the place like week 1 usually is. But without further ado, let's get prepared for week 2 and hop into our starts and sits at the running back position. All right, Thursday night football, we've got the Chargers at the Chiefs. And man, listen, the Chargers look great in week 1 overall, playing against the Raiders. And I know that Austin Ekeler really put up almost an egg, just a sad day overall. He really only showed value in full PPR leagues. He had those 4 targets, made the most out of them, so to speak, with 4 receptions, 36 receiving yards, 36 rushing yards on the ground off 14 attempts. So in full PPR, that was just over 11 fantasy points. If you were in standard league, that was just over 7 fantasy points. So really, I expected this to be a much better day for Austin Ekeler as a whole. But if you were to throw a touchdown on the stat line, it would have been a much better day. So I still believe in Ekeler. I think he's going to be very consistent all season long. I'm not ready to give up on Ekeler and what will be even more of a shootout than last week versus the Raiders. So obviously, if you drafted Ekeler, he's probably right. There's no way he's not your RB1. Don't give up on Ekeler, especially if you're in a half PPR or standard league. He's going to be perfectly fine. This game script absolutely suits him. All right, looking at the Chiefs, man, Clyde, my boy, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. What a day as a whole. I mean, what a day for the Chiefs, right, in week 1. Overall, 7 rushing attempts, 42 rushing yards on the ground for CEH, 3 receptions for 32 receiving yards, but most importantly, 2 out of those 3 receptions were touchdowns. So CEH looked great in week 1. I think this is another good game script for him, another good overall outing. I would not expect necessarily what we saw last week for CEH, but I do think that he is absolutely worth a start at the RB2 or the flex position on your fantasy rosters heading into this matchup. And keep an eye on my boy Isaiah P, who did find the end zone, but also more importantly, 12 rushing attempts in this game, 62 rushing yards as a whole. Listen, I do think it's possible he got more touches in this game because the Chiefs were up ahead basically this entire game, but don't be surprised if he is utilized here in week 2 against the Chargers. He's definitely a player to keep an eye on. If you're in a deeper league or a double flex league, you could consider him in the flex, but me personally, I continue to keep an eye on him and see how the Chiefs continue to use the young running back. All right, moving into Sunday's action, we got the Patriots at the Steelers. I am sitting the Patriots running backs. They were very disappointing in week 1. I really expected a better outing against Miami, but it was just a bad overall offensive performance, and I am definitely sitting the Patriots running backs if Mac Jones is not playing this game. Even with TJ Watt out for the Steelers, I think that Steelers defense is going to have a phenomenal day. I mean, this is just a bad game script for the running backs. Don't get me wrong, if these Patriots do make their way down the field at any point in this game, it's very likely that one of these 2 players, Ramondre Stevenson or Damian Harris, could find the end zone. But I just don't like this game script. I mean, maybe in a deep league, a double flex league, you could throw one of the 2 players in your lineup, but I would sit these 2 guys headed into week 2. Looking at last week, Ramondre Stevenson had just over 4.5 points in full PPR, and Damian Harris had just under 8 points. Just not a good outing overall for the 2 backs. All right, we need to talk about Najee Harris at the end of the day, right? Okay, listen, the foot injury happens, in the preseason, right? Then we have the re-aggravated injury on Sunday. A scary scene for Najee Harris owners. I get it, right? And listen, the Patriots defense didn't look very good last week. Maybe they make the right adjustments. But overall, I think the game script in week 2 favors the Steelers. But listen, there's an asterisk next to Najee Harris's name, right? If we get reports that things aren't looking good, then we might have to consider not starting Najee Harris. And listen, here's the thing, right? If you drafted Najee Harris, he's an RB1 on your team, right? So it's kind of a priority that if you are a Najee Harris owner at this point in the season with the injury, that you're taking a heavy look at Jaylen Warren on the waiver wires and handcuffing Najee Harris. But with that being said, I mean, Najee had a pretty good day against Cincinnati, netted you 18 points in full PPR scoring formats, only 23 rushing yards off 10 attempts, but he had 2 receptions and 3 receiving yards, and most importantly, a touchdown to actually give you some solidification in that stat line. Guys, I get it. It's not a start that you feel extremely confident in, but at the moment, Najee Harris has stated as of the time that I'm recording this that he will practice and play this week. So guys, there's an asterisk there for a reason. If you're not handcuffing Najee, or if you're not trying to make a play to trade Najee, then you're starting it. Like, you have to start him as an RB1 on your roster. So if you feel like you're in a good enough position, maybe you drafted well in the later rounds, I don't know, maybe Michael Carter, James Robinson, some of those guys that performed well in week 1 are hanging around on your roster, maybe you could consider sitting him. But for a majority of fantasy managers, like I said, you're either looking to have a handcuff situation throughout the season as a security blanket, you're looking to trade Najee Harris, or you're ignoring all of the injury news and you have full confidence to play Najee Harris as the running back 1 that you drafted him. And I think for a majority of you guys watching that video, that's what you're going to have to do moving into week 2. All right, Panthers at Giants. You're starting Christian McCaffrey. I mean, this is one of the easiest slides of the entire day. CMC, hey look, 54 total yards in week 1, back in action, has a rushing touchdown, right? The Panthers looked good enough, good enough, but at the end of the day, double-digit fantasy points for Christian McCaffrey. Surprise, surprise, over 20 fantasy points, 22.47 on average in full PPR scoring format. So a nice overall day for CMC. He looks to be back in action, so it's great to see, right? I mean, we're happy for our boy CMC, but a similar player to Christian McCaffrey, you got Saquon Barkley on the Giants going up against the Panthers. Another player who looks like he is back in action. A phenomenal day for Saquon Barkley, literally leading the Giants to a victory over the Titans in week 1. 32.4 points on average in full PPR scoring formats. He had a touchdown. He had 164 rushing yards and 6 receptions for 30 receiving yards. These are 2 players that are in your lineups unquestionably. Does not matter who they're going up against, and in week 2 they are in your lineups. All right, Jets at the Browns. Listen, I'm taking a chance here and I'm saying start Michael Carter. I liked what we saw out of Michael Carter against the Ravens in week 1. Believe it or not, 10 attempts for 60 rushing yards on the ground, 9 targets, 7 receptions, and 40 receiving yards. Then ended you 17 fantasy points in full PPR. I thought it was a good performance as a whole. If he had a touchdown, this is a pretty monster performance for week 1. So I think he could have another good stat line in week 2 against the Browns, but I'm still saying to flex BREECE Hall. I don't think I would give up on BREECE Hall necessarily, although he did have the fumble in week 1, which did turn into a turnover as well. Overall, 6 rushing attempts, 23 rushing yards, but a nice 10 targets. The 10 targets are what stand out to me, with Joe Flacco continuing to be the quarterback for the Jets in week 2. Made 6 total receptions off those 10 targets and 38 receiving yards. So once again, if you add a touchdown to this stat line, it's not bad whatsoever. Full PPR, that netted you just over 10 fantasy points. So I still think BREECE Hall is a flex option. I don't want to see him fumble again, because I do think that as the season progresses, he is definitely a player who could start to get a majority of the touches in that backfield. But at the moment, I say start Michael Carter and consider BREECE Hall as a flex. And similar, looking at the Browns running backs as a whole, I would start Nick Chubb. He had 22 rushing attempts for 141 rushing yards. Full PPR, that was just over 14.5 fantasy points. Listen, it's a good day on the ground. That is what we are going to see out of Nick Chubb, hopefully on a regular basis. The only knock here is he did not find the end zone. Who did find the end zone twice on Sunday was KAREEM Hunt. What a great late round draft value. KAREEM Hunt looks to be, again, at this point in the season, I don't know, he looked the same way last year. Hopefully he doesn't get hurt. God forbid that. But at the end of the day, man, 46 rushing yards off 11 attempts, 1 rushing touchdown, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 24 receiving yards, and a score for Hunt. So I love him as a flex option. I mean, he's someone you can consider as a starter if you don't have better options at the moment as well. But I think for majority of rosters, he's a very solid flex option moving into week 2. All right, we've got the Colts at the Jaguars. So obviously you're starting Jonathan Taylor. There's no doubt about it. I'm convinced whoever made the schedule this year for the NFL was planning on drafting Jonathan Taylor #1 overall this year, because he gave him the Texans in week 1. Then he gave him the Jaguars in week 2. I mean, come on. Week 1, he has 31 rushing attempts, 161 rushing yards, and a score, as well as 4 receptions, just over 20 fantasy points in week 1. What do you expect? He's going to steamroll these first 2 teams in the first 2 weeks. There's no doubt. Doesn't matter who JT's going up against. He's a starter for you, but you just got to love those first 2 matchups. Nyheim Hines, on the other end, did have just over 9 fantasy points in full PPR. He made the most out of his 6 targets, 6 receptions for 50 receiving yards. So he's someone in deeper leagues you can still consider as a flex, but I really do think that the ceiling is relatively capped. He's going to have moments throughout the season, but the ceiling's capped because JT is going to be the guy at the end of the day. All right, let's take a look at the Jaguars running backs. Right, I do think that Etienne and Robinson are both flex options. I said all off season long, Etienne's going to get plenty of opportunities. He's going to get plenty of touches in this offense, but do not forget about James Robinson, who had 11 rushing attempts, 66 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 2 targets, one of them, very importantly, a touchdown in the red zone. The better fantasy performance was James Robinson, who had just under 20 fantasy points, while Travis Etienne had just over 7 fantasy points, 47 yards on the ground off 4 rushing attempts. I mean, pretty good average yard per carry at 11.75. He had 4 targets, 2 receptions. He did have 1 fumble, which hurt his stat line. So listen, Etienne is still getting the opportunities, and I still think making pretty good out of those opportunities, but we're going to have to see how things look in the next couple of weeks with this backfield until we get more clarification on how these 2 backs are going to be split. They are both flex options for me, and flex options in week 2 going up against the Colts. All right, Dolphins at Ravens. I think this will actually be kind of a fun game overall. I'm starting Chase Edmonds, especially in full PPR. I mean, I've said it all off season. I'm not a massive fan of Chase Edmonds, but I am a fan of Chase Edmonds in full PPR at the end of the day. Last week in week 1 against New England, he had 12 rushing attempts for just 25 rushing yards, so not great there, just over 2 yards per carry on average, but 4 targets, 4 receptions, 40 receiving yards. That is where he holds his fantasy value, and I like him in this matchup against the Ravens. He really acted as a security blanket out of the backfield for Tua, and I absolutely seen that being the case in the next coming weeks as well. And I would sit the Ravens running backs, guys. Hey, for those of you guys who I told to start Mike Davis if you needed to last minute last week, I am sorry. I mean, the other thing I said about the Ravens, like all offseason long, is like, I'm not a fan of going after J.K. Dobbins in the draft. I'm not a fan of getting Gus Edwards at the end of the drafts. And I wasn't a fan of Mike Davis or Kenyon Drake as the season began, because at the end of the day, we're going to just see a plethora of running backs utilized in this offense. And you've still got Lamar Jackson as the starting quarterback, who obviously can get it down on the ground. So Kenyon Drake ended up with the most rushing attempts at 11. He didn't do a ton with those rushing attempts, 31 yards on the ground, and he added 1 reception for 15 receiving yards. Well, Mike Davis was an absolute bust. I mean, 2 rushing attempts for 11 rushing yards. It's just a mess of a backfield, guys. Until we see somebody really come on and be consistent for more than 3 or 4 weeks, I don't want to start any Ravens running backs unless, I don't know, J.K. Dobbins comes back and just looks absolutely electrifying and it feels like no one else is going to replace him. I don't know. Without a doubt in my mind, in week 2, I'm sitting the Ravens running backs until we see something further. All right, Buccaneers at Saints. I would start Leonard Fournette in this game. I really thought that the Saints defense would look better than they did in week 1 against the Falcons. I mean, they're still talented enough to step up against the Buccaneers, but overall, when we look at week 1 against Dallas for Fournette. He had 21 rushing attempts, 127 yards on the ground, and added 2 receptions for 10 receiving yards. No scores, but that did net you just over 17 fantasy points in full PPR. And I really think that this is just going to be your, bell cow back for the Buccaneers. They are going to feed Leonard Fournette until his legs fall off. So maybe keep an eye on Rachaad White as a handcuff. But for the moment, I really don't mind what defense Fournette is going up against. I do think he's essentially a must start on a weekly basis as long as he's healthy. And, speaking of weekly must starts, as long as they're healthy, Alvin Kamara is another one without a doubt. Had a rib issue in week 1, so he did have to exit the game. It was, relatively disappointing as a whole. Of course, he just netted you over 7 fantasy points, about 7.6. 9 attempts on the ground, 39 rushing yards, added 3 receptions off 4 targets for 7 receiving yards. There's no doubt in my mind if Kamara was in this game longer, he would have a much better stat line and would have been able to impact the game even more. So I think in week 2, without a doubt, right? Kamara's in your lineup. He's listed as healthy. He is a must start on a weekly basis and a must start moving into week 2 against the Buccaneers. All right, we got the Commanders at the Lions. Both these teams had exciting week 1s. The Commanders came out with a victory and the Lions came out with a loss against the Eagles. And I do think Antonio Gibson, I really like Gibson going into week 1 against the Jaguars, and I really like Gibson again here in week 2 going up against the Lions, who gave up quite a few rushing touchdowns in week 1 to the Eagles. When we look at what Gibby did in week 1, he had 20 points in full PPR scoring format, 14 rushing attempts for 58 rushing yards, no touchdowns, but he added 7 receptions off 8 targets for 72 receiving yards. So even in standard scoring formats, he still got you double-digit fantasy points. It was a good outing overall. If you added touchdowns, it's a really nice stat line. I believe that Gibson will have another good week in week 2 against the Lions, and what I think could be a very similar game in terms of points scored to what we saw in week 1 as a whole. And speaking of the Lions, man, gosh, I really started to have that feeling towards the end of the offseason that DeAndre Swift is just going to have a monster year. Man, if he stays healthy, there's no doubt in my mind that he is going to be an absolute baller. Added you just over 26.5 fantasy points in full PPR. He had 15 rushing attempts for 144 rushing yards and a score, as well as 3 receptions for 31 receiving yards. And if it wasn't for, either getting A, gassed on the way down the field, or B, the Lions just wanting to utilize Jamaal Williams in the red zone, DeAndre Swift could have had an absolutely monster day, or an even more monster day than he had, because we saw Jamaal Williams score 2 touchdowns in this game. Ended up with 16 fantasy points in full PPR off 11 rushing attempts, and had those 2 scores in the red zone. So I do think there's a possibility. I've got Jamaal Williams down as a watch, that we do see some production out of Jamaal Williams on the season in the red zone, but we want to keep a close eye on it. We want to make sure this isn't just what happened in week 1. We really want to keep a close eye on how this, quote unquote committee is used. I think without a doubt Swift is the guy, but there is some potential to see Jamaal Williams on 3rd down and in the red zone. So we'll continue to monitor the Lions backfield. But as a whole, if you own either of these backs, I would feel pretty good moving into week 2. All right, we've got the Seahawks at the San Francisco 49ers. I would take a chance and start Rashaad Penny. Listen, I didn't love him in week 1 going up against the Broncos, but I did believe he would get enough rushing attempts to put up a decent stat line. He had a fumble in week 1, which really hurt his stat line as a whole, but he had 12 rushing attempts for 60 rushing yards. It wasn't a good outing. He added 2 receptions for 7 receiving yards. So in full PPR, that netted you just over 7.5 points in full PPR. So listen, I'm not crazy about this start, but I do think that this game script could end up being one where the Seahawks come out and they want to win this divisional game after a strong outing in week 1. So listen, just about every other start that we've gone over today, I like more than Rashaad Penny. But once again, I do think that the volume could be there, and all he really needs is to find the end zone for a respectable fantasy stat line. So I think, depending on the right roster, Rashaad Penny could be a start moving into week 2. But like I said, I mean, if you have better options, don't get crazy with this one. This is really more of a desperate start as a whole. I wouldn't even consider him a flex. This is, I don't have anyone better, but Penny's on my team. I think the volume is there, but like I said, the ceiling is not great. So he's probably my least favorite start on today's video overall, but I still have some faith in RASHAAD Penny as a starter that I'm not giving up on. All right, I would sit the Niners running backs. I get it, guys. Elijah Mitchell is going to miss about 8 weeks, about 2 months total, and everyone is jumping on the Jeff Wilson bandwagon. And I get it. We talked about the waiver wire moves Monday night, and I had Wilson on there. You have to kind of talk about it naturally, but at the end of the day, like, if I'm going to pick up Jeff Wilson, I don't know if I want to start him like right away with confidence, because what's going to happen, right? We know how Kyle Shanahan operates. You're going to get Shanahan. You're going to get slapped in the face if you own a San Francisco 49ers running back. And listen, Jeff Wilson could be very productive. The opportunity is there with the matchup against the Seahawks. They did not look very good against the run in week 1, with Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon out there. Not that they had crazy games. They played well enough, right? And at least in the red zone, the Seahawks defense looked good against the run. But I do think that the opportunity is there for whoever gets the most touches for the San Francisco 49ers, whether it's Jeff Wilson, TDP, maybe Jordan Mason, maybe Deebo Samuel, maybe Kyle Juszczyk, maybe Trey Lance. I don't know, guys. It's just, that's really the other problem when we talk about a guy like Jeff Wilson or TDP potentially, right? Trey Lance is going to run the ball and Deebo Samuel is going to run the ball, on top of the fact that you might get Shanahan, right? So I would sit the Niners running backs unless you're absolutely desperate. I don't really like them going into this matchup in week 2. All right, we got the Falcons at the Rams. And listen, guys, I don't want to say sit all the Falcons running backs, but I just have a bad feeling, right? Like, Tyler Allgeier's not in your lineup, and Damian Williams is not in your lineup and he did avoid a serious injury, which is a good thing. But for whatever reason, I just feel like the Rams defense is going to play very well in week 2 and have a bounce back type game after that, poor performance in week 1 against the Bills. But really, when you look at what the Rams did, although they gave up 31 points, they still caused 4 turnovers. It was a really good defensive effort against what is probably going to be the best offense arguably in the entire league this year, maybe next to the Chiefs. So that's based off week 1. But regardless, right, listen, if Cordarrelle Patterson is on your bench, he's a strong flex this week. Like, let's not deny what he did in week 1. Just over 22 fantasy points, 22 rushing attempts, 120 rushing yards, and a score, and added 3 receptions. Like, I'm not knocking Patterson whatsoever. Listen, he's going to be utilized within this offense. Marcus Mariota looked pretty good last week, but I just have one of those feelings, man. I mean, you got to make some calls throughout the season. I had one of those feelings that the Rams just might show up a lot more in week 2 than they did in week 1 as a whole. But like I said, Patterson is still a flex player without a doubt, but I do think we're going to have times throughout the season where Patterson plays really well like he did in week 1. Then we have some inconsistent weeks sprinkled in there. So what we have to try and do is target those inconsistent weeks. But there's a strong chance that Patterson shuts up all of us fantasy managers out here, and he does what he did last year and just absolutely balls out and surprises us. So I don't know. Like I said, Patterson in the flex. Outside of that, don't get fancy and try and throw Tyler Allgeier in your lineup because Williams got injured. Guys, I said it all offseason. Please don't draft Cam Akers. Draft Darrell Henderson at the end of your draft. The overall value is going to be so much better, and there's still a chance at any point in this season that McVay says, hey, Akers is our new starter, just like he did last year when Henderson's a little bit banged up and they brought on Sony Michel. But at the end of the day, right now, this is Henderson's backfield. I don't care what anyone has to say about it. I'm starting Hendo. Week 1, he had 13 rushing attempts for 47 rushing yards and added 5 receptions for 26 receiving yards. Listen, this is really only a good stat line in full PPR where he got you just over 12 fantasy points. But at the end of the day, it's Henderson's backfield, okay? And Cam Akers is a sit for me. Without a doubt, 0 fantasy points in week 1, 3 rushing attempts for 0 yards. Sean McVay came out and said he needs to maximize his opportunities. He only had 3 opportunities. I guess he didn't maximize them. But you guys know, if you guys are follow the channel, that I have been a big fan of Darrell Henderson. And I believe for the time being, this is Hendo's backfield. And I like this matchup a lot going up against the Falcons in week 2. All right, speaking of things I talked about all off season, how about my boy James Conner in week 1? Listen, wasn't a very efficient effort. It wasn't a very good effort offensively by the Cardinals as a whole. But say what you want about the offense, James Conner had 15.5 fantasy points in full PPR. 10 rushing attempts for 26 rushing yards. Not a good yards per carry at 2.6, but 1 score and added 5 receptions. So I'm just happy that James Conner had double-digit fantasy points, and I like him again in week 2 versus the Raiders. I think this is going to be a good matchup overall. I like the opportunity for both of these backs, but I was really confident that Josh Jacobs would have a pretty good week 1 against the Chargers and that, shootout and the game script, divisional game, everything, but he was really disappointing. 10 rushing attempts, 57 rushing yards. His yards per carry netted at 5.7. He had 1 reception, so full PPR, that was just over 8 fantasy points. If he finds the end zone, it's a much better stat line. I do think it's possible he could find the end zone in week 2. So overall, I've got Jacobs as a flex. If you don't have a better option, I like him more in half PPR and standard scoring formats, of course. But at the end of the day, I still have some faith in Josh Jacobs. I was a fan and believer of Josh Jacobs in the offseason at the right price in your drafts, and I still think he's going to have productive moments throughout the season. So like I said, he's a flex for me in week 2, and let's keep a close eye on that Raiders backfield as things continue to progress into the season. All right, the Texans at the Broncos. This could be an interesting game. Davis Mills looked okay in week 1. The Texans pull out an upset victory against the Colts, and who didn't look so great? Dameon Pierce, right? Listen, guys, I love Pierce throughout the offseason. Before that Dameon Pierce hype train was even a thing, I feel like I was the original Dameon Pierce hype up man. But at the end of the day, right, 11 rushing attempts, 33 rushing yards, 1 reception for 6 receiving yards, just under 5 points in full PPR. A very disappointing day for Dameon Pierce. And who got the most touches in that backfield? Well, of course, Rex Burkhead did. 14 rushing attempts for 40 rushing yards, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 30 receiving yards, which did net you 12 fantasy points in full PPR. I did have double-digit fantasy points. But at the end of the day, man, I'm sitting both the Texans running backs. I want to see how this split continues to look, how the usage for both backs, being Rex Burkhead and Dameon Pierce, looks. I just don't feel confident throwing either of these guys in my lineup. I am still confident in one thing, and that is as the season goes on, Dameon Pierce will be the guy. But for the time being, I would just sit both these players. I'm not even necessarily crazy about going out and getting Burkhead on the waiver wire unless something happens to Dameon Pierce. But at the end of the day, for now, especially here in week 2 against the Broncos, it's a sit for both the Texans running backs for myself. All right, Javonte Williams led the Broncos in targets in their week 1 loss. Had 12 targets, 11 receptions for 65 receiving yards. He had 7 rushing attempts for 43 rushing yards. So that did net you in full PPR just over 18 fantasy points. It was a good overall day, but he did have the fumble, right? And that was a big problem for the Broncos. I mean, they looked awful in the red zone. The coaching was all over the place. It was just a mess of a game. We don't need to get into that one, but I was slightly concerning, but I think that the Broncos will bounce back and definitely they'll stay competitive against the Texans. And Javonte, in my opinion, is the back to own. Although we did see, of course, somewhat of a split overall with Melvin Gordon involved as well, who also had a fumble in this game. I mean, just an absolutely disappointing game for both of these players, and what a lot of fantasy managers thought was a great matchup. So Melvin Gordon, 12 rushing attempts, 58 rushing yards, 2 targets, 14 receiving yards, and full PPR that was just over 6 fantasy points. So Javonte with the better outing in week 1. He is my start out of the 2, but I still think based on the matchup that you could flex Melvin Gordon if you absolutely needed to, especially in double flex leagues or deeper leagues. And last week I liked Gordon as a flex, and that was it. If you want to leave it on your bench, I don't blame you, but if you need to, you could flex him. Javonte is definitely the running back to start off of this matchup moving into week 2. All right, Bengals at Cowboys should be a good matchup, even with Dak not in this game. For whatever reason, I just feel like it's going to be a fun game at the end of the day. All right, Joe Mixon is a start for me at the end of the day. A really good stat line in week 1, although he did not find the end zone. 27 rushing attempts, 82 yards on the ground, 9 targets, 7 receptions for 63 receiving yards. I netted him just over 21 fantasy points in full PPR. So I love Mixon. I mean, all season long, this is going to be one of my favorite running backs. I don't think you're going to see me tell you to start or sit Joe Mixon, probably ever. He's one of my favorite running backs going into the season. I love him in this matchup. Get him in your starting lineups without a doubt. All right, I would start Zeke. Listen, 10 rushing attempts, 52 rushing yards, 2 targets, 1 reception. Not a good fantasy outing in week 1. I get it. 5.9 points in full PPR. But with the injury to Dak Prescott, there's one or two ways you could look at this, right? Defense are going to stack the box. They're going to shut down Zeke. Or Zeke and Pollard are just going to get more opportunities and make the most of them, right? I think at any point, if the Cowboys get into the red zone, they're going to hand the ball off to Zeke and he gets you a respectable fantasy stat line. Am I crazy about Zeke right now? No. Am I crazy about the Cowboys offense right now? No. But hey, Cooper Rush can make some things happen at the end of the day. So listen, I think Zeke, if you have to start him, if you don't hit the waiver wire this week, if you're not able to get a replacement that you're more confident in, you probably drafted Zeke as your RB2, right? So I think if you're not in a better position that you can start Zeke, but maybe there should have been a little bit of an asterisk here. I'm losing a little bit of faith in that Cowboys offense. I would sit Tony Pollard for now, who netted you just over 4 fantasy points in week 1. And if you could argue you could sit Zeke here as well. I think if you're going to start one of the two in week 2, it's Zeke. But like I said, just understand that the ceilings are capped here. We've seen, Dak get hurt before and defenses just game plan to shut down Zeke. So listen, we're banking on a touchdown here. Do I love the odds? I like this matchup for whatever reason, so I'll take a chance here. Am I 100% confident? If you don't have better options, I'd start Zeke, but like I said, the ceiling is probably capped moving into week 2. All right, we got the Bears at the Packers. The Bears pulling off an upset win in the rain. Listen, David Monty, not a great fantasy day. 8 fantasy points in full PPR, 26 yards on the ground off 17 attempts, 4 targets, 3 receptions. I'm not ready to give up on Monty just yet, and the rain did affect things here, but I'm just not completely ready to give up on Monty. Still think he's a flex option, but I think Khalil Herbert in his sophomore season is probably a flex option as well. He had 9 rushing attempts, 45 rushing yards, and a score in week 1. The better fantasy performer was Khalil Herbert, just over 11 fantasy points in week 1 against the Niners. So I like Herbert, but I still believe in Monty. It's going to be an interesting backfield to keep an eye on throughout the season. At the moment, I'm going to leave them both as flexes if you don't have better options. Probably like them better in half PPR and standard scoring formats. All right, I would start the Packers running backs, guys. Okay, Aaron Jones, not a crazy day, but in full PPR, he did net you over 10.5 fantasy points. 5 attempts on the ground, 49 rushing yards. Really where he made the most of his value was 3 receptions for 27 receiving yards. And when you look at A.J. Dillon, on the other hand, 10 rushing attempts, 45 rushing yards, 6 targets, 5 receptions overall. And he did have the rushing touchdown on the day. He was the most productive player on the Packers from a fantasy perspective, netting you just over 20 fantasy points. And talk about a player that I was absolutely in love with drafting over the offseason that I got in absolutely 0 in my leagues. That's A.J. Dillon, and I think A.J. Dillon is the player to start out of anyone in this matchup. But don't give up on Aaron Jones yet. We know how talented he is, and obviously with how week 1 looked for the Packers, Aaron Rodgers and company are going to be calling on these 2 running backs early and often throughout this matchup. So I still like Aaron Jones, but I'm maybe just an A.J. Dillon believer. I think both are great starts, great flexes as well moving into week 2. All right, Titans at Bills. I get it's a stout Bills defense. They looked great in week 1. Didn't allow too much on the ground from the Rams, right? But listen, even with Derrick Henry laying an egg in week 1, from a fantasy perspective, he still played pretty all right. 21 rushing attempts for 82 yards on the ground. If he scored a touchdown, no one would even be talking about a disappointing performance for Henry in week 1, although he did have a fumble, which hurt his overall fantasy stat line, netted you just over 7 fantasy points. But we did have a surprise development in that backfield with Dontrell Hilliard looking very, very good in this backfield. Not necessarily on the ground with just 8 rushing yards, but 4 targets, 3 receptions for 61 receiving yards and 2 scores. He netted you over 21 points in full PPR, averaging just over 20 yards per reception. A very good outing for Hilliard, so keep an eye on him. He's going to be a hot name on the waiver wire. We could have a Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt situation brewing here in Tennessee, but let's just keep a close eye on it. I would start Derrick Henry, even though he didn't have a great fantasy performance in week 1. He's still Derrick Henry, and keep a close eye on Hilliard. I think in deeper leagues he's a great flex this week, but it's still the Bills defense. We want to see how the Titans continue to roll out both of these running backs. I would sit the Bills running backs here in week 2. And really, when we're talking about the Bills running backs, you know, whether it's Zach Moss, whether it's Cook you have on your bench at the moment, maybe you don't have Cook after week 1, it's Devin Singletary's backfield. At least it was in week 1. Although he just had 8 rushing attempts. He went for 48 rushing yards, had 2 targets, 2 receptions, and 14 receiving yards. Zach Moss looked good in this game. He had 6 targets, 6 receptions in week 1, that is. Then he lost a fumble, right? Then we look at James Cook. He also lost a fumble. So at the moment, I think it's Devin Singletary's backfield. But let's face it, this Bills offense is what they were last year, what they were the year before. They are going to throw the football. They are probably going to throw the football more than ever here in 2022. So I don't think the ceiling is very high. I think Singletary is relatively touchdown dependent. I think you sit him unless you're absolutely desperate. Maybe you went 0 running back in your draft. But even then, I think there may be better options throughout the waiver wire this week. So I would sit Singletary, and I wouldn't think about starting Cook or Moss heading into week 2. All right, Vikings at Eagles. I would start Dalvin Cook. I mean, come on, man. We're starting Cook. The Eagles gave up a lot of rushing yards and a couple rushing touchdowns in week 1. And for Dalvin Cook going up against Green Bay, he netted you just under 14 fantasy points, 20 rushing attempts, 90 rushing yards, and added 3 receptions for 18 receiving yards, netted over 90 total yards. I mean, come on. We're starting Dalvin Cook all day long. There's no doubt about it in this matchup. And I would consider flexing an Eagles running back if you really need to. Why am I not so confident? Because it's still the Eagles running back field. Yes, we saw Miles Sanders find the end zone. Don't get me wrong. We saw Kenneth Gainwell find the end zone. Don't get me wrong. We saw Boston Scott find the end zone. We saw Jalen Hurts rush for a touchdown. Guys, listen, it's a very productive offense on the ground. But from a fantasy standpoint, you were rolling the dice every single week. I like Sanders and Gainwell the most in the flex, and overall, let's face it, right? Miles Sanders had a very productive day. I don't want to take away anything from him. He had 13 rushing attempts for 96 rushing yards, 7.38 yards per carry, and a score. Gainwell, on the other hand, just 20 rushing yards, 2 receptions. Then Boston Scott, 4 rushing attempts for 10 rushing yards. Like I said, they all had a touchdown on the ground. So if I was going to start an Eagles running back in week 2, it's probably Miles Sanders. You can make the argument for Gainwell in full PPR, but at the end of the day, just understand you're rolling the dice. You're starting any of these guys, but I do like the game script. I do like the matchup here, and let's face it, the Eagles are going to run the ball, but like I said, it's a little bit of a risk on a weekly basis. And that'll do it for today's video, man. If you guys did enjoy the content, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel, and feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. Waiver wire starts, sits, roster settings, whatever it may be, let me know in the comments down below. I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.